Before the world turned dark with fear and silence, there was a time of slow rhythm and candlelit simplicity. In the early 1300s, Europe lay beneath a patchwork sky, its villages stitched together by dusty roads and wooden wheels. The pace of life was gentle but burdened. In the fields, peasants bent their backs beneath wide skies. In the towns, merchants peddled silk and salt, and the church bells marked the hours, the seasons, and the heartbeat of medieval life. But something, though unseen, stirred in the east. Far from the cobblestone streets of Florence, beyond the castles of England, and past the forests of the Holy Roman Empire, a shadow was forming. It would not arrive on horseback. It would not come with armies. It would travel in silence and on ships and grain in fleas and in breath. But no one knew that yet. The early 14th century was an age shaped by hierarchy and hope. Kings reigned, bishops preached, and farmers sowed seed with the rhythm of the seasons. Trade flourished from China to the Mediterranean through ancient routes. The Silk Road, bustling with spices, silk, and secret passengers. These routes, designed to enrich empires, would also carry whispers of death. From the trading ports of Constantinople to the spice markets of Venice, goods passed hands, but so did something far smaller, something invisible, something alive. In this chapter of time, Europe was ripe for both greatness and grief. The climate had begun to cool, not enough to worry a ruler, but enough to shrink harvests and raise bread prices. Famine had already visited some lands. The church, powerful but divided, saw its flock multiply even as its power began to stretch thin. People turned inward. Superstition walked alongside religion. The sky, they believed, could speak, through stars, comets, or strange alignments. And in every village, tucked inside candle-lit chapels, there were prayers for protection, from wolves, from war, from hunger. No one yet prayed for protection from the plague, because it had no name. Not yet. Meanwhile, in the far reaches of Central Asia, something ancient awakened. Buried deep in the soil or nested in the warm fur of wild rodents, a microscopic killer, Yersinia pestis, stirred. Harmless in the dark earth, but devastating in the veins of men. Caravans crossed deserts, traders reached distant ports, ships were loaded with silks, wines, and, unknowingly, fleas. And the world turned, oblivious, ordinary. If you stood in a village in France in 1345, you might hear the creaking of carts, the braying of donkeys, and the gentle murmur of Latin prayers at dusk. The world was alive, fragile, yes, but hopeful. People married, bartered, baked bread, and dreamed under cathedral ceilings. They told stories by firelight and passed knowledge hand to hand, a medieval web of connection and meaning. But the web was more than metaphor. It was a network, one that would help the plague travel, faster than news. That was the world, ordinary and blessed. Just 1 year before the whispers began, the kind of whispers that would cross continents. It was the autumn of 1347, when the wind over the Mediterranean was cooler than usual, and the ships came slower to port. In the southern harbour of Messina, Sicily, merchant vessels from the east finally appeared on the horizon, battered, strange, and silent. What dock workers found was not what they expected. These ships were ghostly. Their sails hung slack and their decks were quiet. When boarded, the few sailors still breathing were wild-eyed and fevered. Many were already dead. The survivors spoke of sickness, vast, monstrous, and nameless. The people of Messina recoiled in horror. Some called it divine punishment, others refused to believe it. But the city, open and unguarded, had already welcomed the visitor. The plague had arrived, carried not by warriors or by winds, but by rats, and by the fleas upon them. Hidden in sacks of grain, nestled among silks, they disembarked and found the people waiting. The sickness spread like spilled ink across parchment. 1 person, then 10, then entire streets. Those first days were filled with confusion. It was a sickness unlike any they had known. Sudden swellings beneath the arms or groin, burning fevers, and a blackening of the skin. People died within days, some in hours. Priests blessed bodies too fast to remember names. Bells tolled endlessly, and then fell silent, because so many had died, there was no one left to ring them. Messina tried to resist. Officials closed the ports and drove the Genoese ships back out to sea, but it was too late. Other cities had already accepted goods. Other hands had already touched tainted wares, and the rats, unnoticed and uninvited, travelled in every direction. By December 1347, the plague reached mainland Italy, Marseille, Genoa, Pisa. By spring it crept north, through France into the Holy Roman Empire, from Barcelona to Paris, from monasteries to marketplaces. It rode on boots and breath, through trade routes and caravan trails. It followed pilgrims and priests. It entered homes through bread, cloth and cargo. No village, no castle, no corner was safe. News travelled slower than disease. In distant towns, rumours were all that arrived. Tales of entire cities where the dead outnumbered the living. Of fields left fallow and streets silent, but for the crying of orphans and the soft flap of clothes on empty washing lines. Some dismissed the tales as exaggeration. Others began to pray harder. Some fled. But the plague could not be outrun. In Avignon, where the Pope resided, great fires were lit around the city to purify the air. The pontiff, terrified, sat between two burning braziers for weeks on end. Cardinals died one by one. Monks dug graves until they too fell in. In cities like Florence and Venice, bodies piled faster than they could be buried. Common pits were dug, mass graves called plague trenches, into which carts of corpses were dumped daily. The stench was unimaginable. So too was the silence. Some towns died completely. Not a single voice, not a single dog barking. Just the wind and the flies and the swelling silence. And still it spread. In England, the plague arrived by summer 1348. In London, the narrow streets and cramped homes were perfect breeding grounds. By autumn, the Thames had witnessed thousands of deaths. The air itself seemed heavy. Parliament closed, markets vanished, ships floated untended in the harbour. The world was unravelling quietly and completely. In every country, every town, people asked, "What is this?" Some said it was a punishment from God. Others blamed strangers, or the alignment of planets, or poisoned wells. Some turned to saints, others turned to madness. And as the sickness moved deeper into the heart of Europe, it left behind a question that still echoes centuries later. How do you survive when the world itself is sick? The Black Plague had arrived, and it would not leave quickly. By the year 1348, Europe had begun to quiet in a way that felt unnatural, not peaceful, but breathless. The kind of stillness that follows catastrophe, or perhaps walks beside it. The Black Death had spread like fire across dry fields. Towns that once rang with bells and laughter now sat in the hush of mourning. People wore sorrow like cloaks. Doors were shuttered not from storms, but from fear of neighbours, fear of breath, of touch, of even prayer whispered too closely. In France, once vibrant cities like Paris suffered deeply. Markets that bustled weeks before now housed silent stalls. The Louvre, then a royal palace, hung heavy with the scent of incense and rot. Thousands died. Some collapsed in the streets clutching their chests. Others locked themselves in their homes where they were later found by neighbours, weeks gone and never buried. In England, entire families disappeared in days. Children without parents wandered among the dead. The fields outside London became burial grounds. The rhythm of life, farming, selling, worship, slowed and stumbled. Priests once called to the bedside began to refuse. Even the holy grew afraid. Churches no longer held choirs, only coughing. In the countryside, many believed the cities were cursed and fled, but the sickness came too. Over hills and into villages, into manors and stables. The plague was no respecter of walls. At night, the only light came from candles flickering near altars and windowsills. People clung to rituals, chalk crosses drawn on doors, sweet herbs tied at the wrist, prayers whispered 100 times before sleep. Still, loved ones died. In Germany, fear turned to suspicion. Rumours bloomed in the space left by silence. Some said the plague was caused by poisoned wells and accused the Jewish population. Pogroms followed. Entire communities were blamed, burned, expelled. The fear of death bred cruelty. Rather than binding together, many tore apart. Those who stayed in cities often lived among the dead. With no one left to bury bodies, streets became passageways of decay. In Florence and Hamburg, carts rolled through town with a single hollow cry. "Bring out your dead!" Bodies were thrown onto wagons, names were not asked, stories were not told. It was enough that they had lived, and now no longer did. Painters stopped painting, minstrels stopped singing, theatres, when they existed, sat empty. The only stories being written now were in journals and margins, desperate accounts from monks and physicians trying to understand the shape of their dying world. One monk in a now-lost monastery wrote these words: "This sickness is no lion nor bear that may be bested by spear. It is wind, it is breath, it is God's forgetting." Others echoed the sentiment. It was as though Europe itself had been forgotten, left to wander sick and shadowed through its darkest year. Some turned to faith. Processions of flagellants walked barefoot through cities, whipping their own backs, chanting prayers and begging mercy. Their cries were not quiet, but the heavens gave no reply. The church grew fractured. Bishops died. Entire parishes were left without clergy, and yet others clung more tightly to belief, hoping that somewhere, behind the veil of suffering, something divine still listened. In places like Krakow and Prague, the death toll was lower, possibly spared by natural geography or quick quarantines. But for much of Europe, there were no explanations, no science, no sense, only mourning. Children grew up never knowing normalcy. Some never remembered a time when funerals weren't daily, or when their mothers did not cry silently as they boiled roots and herbs. The plague did not just kill, it changed how people saw the world. Suddenly life was not a gift, it was a question. A quiet rebellion began to stir. In taverns, hushed voices wondered why so many priests and nobles had fled. In fields, survivors asked why their lives were worth less than land. A reckoning was coming, but not yet. For now the dark still had its hold, and in that long shadow, the only certainty was loss. To understand the darkness that fell upon the world in the 14th century, we must step gently into the space between fact and fear, between what was known and what was only imagined. For most of Europe, the plague was a mystery. It moved invisibly, taking the rich and the poor, the pious and the sinful. It arrived without warning and left only silence. Its effects were seen, its causes were not. In the villages and cities where it struck, the symptoms came quickly, often within days, sometimes hours. They began with a fever, sudden, sharp and unrelenting. The skin flushed, the pulse quickened. Then came chills that shook the bones, a sense of dread. Soon after came the swellings, large, painful lumps, usually in the groin, armpits or neck. These buboes, from which the term bubonic plague would be born, were red at first, then turned black, blue or purple. Some burst, others festered. Always they heralded death. And as the infection spread through the body, black spots appeared on the skin. The victim's breath grew laboured, their eyes clouded. Within a day or two, most were gone. The death rate was staggering. By some accounts, 60% or more of the infected died. In some regions, entire populations were reduced by half within months. Towns were left with only children, roads filled with wandering livestock unclaimed and unfed. But what was this plague? Today we know the answer. A bacterium, Yersinia pestis. It was carried by fleas, which lived on rats, which travelled with people in ships, carts, homes, and cellars. The infection spread in several forms: bubonic, the most common, marked by buboes and spread by flea bites; pneumonic, airborne, spread through breath with nearly 100% fatality; septicemic in the blood, often killing within hours, without external symptoms. But in the 14th century there was no microscope, no germ theory, no antibiotics. People made sense of the plague in the ways they knew, through signs in the sky, smells in the air, dreams, sins, and spirits. Some believed the sickness came from miasma, bad air. They burned incense, carried fragrant herbs, and placed flowers near the sick. Plague doctors wore their iconic beaked masks stuffed with lavender and myrrh in hopes of filtering the air. Others believed it was divine punishment, a great reckoning for humanity's sin. The alignment of Saturn and Jupiter in 1345 was blamed by astrologers. Strange weather and red skies were taken as omens. In monasteries, physicians wrote long treatises, suggesting hot baths, bleeding, or fasting. Some advised people to avoid bathing, believing it opened the skin to infection. Others encouraged prayers to saints like St. Sebastian, believed to intercede during epidemics. Still others fled cities, hoping that the countryside would offer protection. And some, in despair, turned to magic. Charms were sold. Elixirs made from crushed emeralds or unicorn horn. None worked. But hope, even false hope, was a balm. The plague doctor became an enduring symbol of this age. Clad in dark robes and gloves, their faces hidden behind long-nosed masks, they moved among the dying with measured steps. The beak contained herbs. The staff kept distance. They were hired by cities, not churches, for even the clergy had fled in many places. Though these doctors could do little, their presence offered comfort, a sign that someone still watched, still cared, still stayed. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a blend of reason and ritual, much of it traced back to Galen and Hippocrates, ancient thinkers whose humoral theories shaped Western medicine for centuries. Disease, they believed, was a result of imbalances in the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. The plague did not fit neatly into that system, nor did it obey rules. It struck monasteries and brothels alike, rich and poor, knight and beggar. And this, perhaps, was its most terrifying trait. It did not choose. As the disease continued its course, a quiet shift began to take root in the mind of Europe. People began to question old answers, to observe, to compare. Some wrote what they saw, careful records of symptoms, survival, spread. These seeds, sown in grief, would later blossom into modern medicine. But that was a future still sleeping. In the 1340s, the world knew only loss, only the ache of unanswered prayers, and the sound of a body falling, alone. Though history often draws its maps with bold lines, the plague cared nothing for borders. It did not stop at rivers, nor mountains, nor man-made walls. It moved like a whisper, or a curse, across continents. Europe was the stage where the Black Death became most famous, but it was not its only victim. To understand its true scope, we must look beyond cathedrals and castles, to the trade routes, caravans, and distant cities that also heard the same terrible silence. Many historians believe the first major outbreak of the plague began in Central Asia, perhaps near the steppes of Mongolia or the borderlands of China. Here, ancient rodent populations carried Yersinia pestis for centuries. In these vast grasslands and mountain regions, trade caravans moved through bustling outposts and Silk Road cities. It's likely that the disease spread first through small towns, unnoticed, until it reached larger hubs of commerce and transit. China, in the early 1330s, recorded unusual pestilences. Some accounts describe entire provinces losing large portions of their population. Famines and floods had already strained the country. The arrival of plague was a final blow. Though records are inconsistent, it's believed that tens of millions may have died across Asia, a loss so wide it became woven into mythology and silence. The Mongol Empire at its height linked east and west through a vast, if fragile, system of roads and rulers. Pax Mongolica allowed ideas and goods to travel with ease, but also allowed the plague to hitch a ride from city to city, soldier to soldier, grain sack to grain sack. It is said that in 1346, during the siege of the Crimean port city of Kaffa, Mongol forces catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, possibly one of the first examples of biological warfare. Italian traders inside fled, carrying the plague with them by sea all the way to Sicily. In the Middle East and North Africa, the plague swept through cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Damascus. These were centres of science, art, and literature, and they suffered as terribly as any. Cairo, one of the largest cities in the world at the time, saw its population cut in half. Eyewitness accounts from Muslim scholars and doctors reveal the heartbreak of the era. Entire lineages disappeared. Schools emptied. Markets turned silent. Imams and doctors debated the cause. Some accepted contagion. Others insisted it was divine will. In Mecca, pilgrims brought not only devotion, but disease. The faithful still gathered, but many never returned home. India too was struck. Though records are sparse, signs of disruption, abandoned temples, missing family lines, point to significant loss. In each place the symptoms were the same, the fear was the same, and the isolation too was shared, whether in the mountains of Persia or the fields of Bohemia. In times of fear, people seek answers, and when answers are absent, they often create enemies. Across Europe, rumours spread that the plague was not natural, that it had been caused by poison, by sorcery, by secret hands. Jewish communities were especially targeted. False accusations claimed they had poisoned wells or brought disease through dark ritual. These rumours spread faster than truth. In hundreds of towns, Strasbourg, Basel, Mainz, mobs burned synagogues, expelled entire families, and committed acts of mass violence. Some rulers tried to protect their Jewish subjects. Others allowed the persecutions or ignored them. In many places, centuries-old communities vanished overnight. This too was a legacy of the plague, not just death, but division. While Europe turned to flagellants and incense, other societies sought different cures. In parts of the Islamic world, scholars documented the disease and attempted early public health efforts, quarantines, regulated burials, and cleaning practices. In India and Persia, folk medicine blended with religious rites. Some burned fragrant woods, others fasted or held night-long chants. Though the methods differed, the pain was the same. People losing those they loved, cities shrinking, hope thinning. The plague spoke in many languages, but its voice was always the same. As the disease raced along routes once used for silk, sugar and spices, the engine of global trade shuddered. Merchants stopped travelling, ships sat empty in harbours, caravans turned back, fortunes vanished. Entire ports closed themselves off, lighting fires at their gates and refusing all entry. The world became quieter, not just from death, but from disconnection. For nearly a decade, the global economy bent under the weight of grief and uncertainty. From China to Constantinople, from Cairo to Cornwall, the plague left the same trail. Candles burnt for too many lost, children orphaned, streets emptied of song. And though borders were drawn by kings, the disease erased them, making one continent, one world, one suffering people. Later generations would rebuild, would redraw those lines. But for a brief moment in history, the world shared a silence, and the echoes of that silence still linger. By the time the Black Death loosened its grip, sometime around 1353, the world that remained bore little resemblance to the one that had stood just 6 years before. It had been reshaped, not by kings nor by wars, but by silence, by absence, by the gaping spaces left where laughter used to echo, where bread used to bake, where bells used to ring. The plague had taken not just life, but structure. And now something new would emerge. Historians have long debated the true toll of the Black Death. Records were sparse. Clerks, priests and scribes died too. Whole villages vanished without leaving behind names or markers. But the estimates remain staggering. In Europe alone, between 25 to 50 million people died, roughly 1/3 to half of the population. China, India, the Middle East and North Africa may have seen tens of millions more perish. In some towns, mortality rates reached 80 to 90%. In England, the population fell from around 6 million to just over 3 million within a few years. No corner was untouched, no class was spared. It was not a war, but it changed the world as profoundly as any battlefield. Before the plague, most people in Europe worked the land under feudal lords. Serfs were bound to their manors, tied to soil, debt, and duty. But when the plague ended, fields lay fallow, harvests rotted, there were too few hands to plough or reap. Suddenly the common labourer held power. With demand high and workers few, wages rose. Serfs began to demand freedom. Some simply walked away from the land. For the first time, mobility became possible. Feudalism, once unshakable, began to crack. It would not fall overnight, but it would never again stand unchallenged. In England, discontent brewed, as nobles tried to reinstate the old order, taxing heavily and resisting wage increases. Resistance formed. In 1381, just a generation after the plague, the peasants' revolt erupted, a direct consequence of the shifting balance of power. It would be put down, but the message rang out. The world had changed, and the people knew it. Strange as it may sound, the plague also sparked urban renewal. In cities emptied by death, space opened. Overcrowded homes were abandoned, infrastructure was rebuilt, streets widened, sanitation slowly improved. Guilds, those ancient trade associations, evolved. Some collapsed from lack of members, others merged. New professions emerged, and literacy began to spread. With fewer mouths to feed, resources stretched further. Survivors inherited land, shops, money, even titles. A new middle class began to rise. It was as though the social soil had been turned over, and something unfamiliar began to grow. The church, once the supreme authority in most lives, emerged from the plague, humbled. So many priests had died that spiritual care had often ceased entirely. Some clergy had abandoned their posts. Others had fallen trying to serve. But the result was the same: doubt. Many began to question the institution's power. Why had prayers failed? Why had God allowed such pain? Faith did not vanish, but religion changed. Lay movements grew. Mystics and reformers emerged. Quiet revolutions in belief took root, some of which would eventually fuel the Reformation. Before the plague, death was a distant guest. Sudden death was rare. Most people had rituals, time to prepare, to confess, to gather loved ones. But the Black Death came without warning, without time. As a result, people's relationship with death changed. Art began to reflect it. In cathedrals and manuscripts, the danse macabre appeared, the dance of death. Skeletons leading kings, bishops and peasants alike in a grim parade. Mortality was now ever present, not tragic, not noble, just real. It crept into the culture like a shadow beneath every lamp. In the vacuum left by old explanations, a hunger for knowledge grew. Some survivors believed the plague had been a test. Others sought reason, logic, and understanding. Early scientists, physicians, and thinkers began to emerge. They asked, what caused disease? How did the body work? Could nature be understood? In Italy, just a few decades later, this spark would ignite the Renaissance, a rebirth of art, science, and humanism. The plague had scoured the land, but it had also cleared the path. For those who lived, life was never the same. Some spoke of plague dreams, vivid, dark visions that lingered for years. Others lived more urgently, marrying quickly, spending freely, building boldly. There was a sense that time was thin, that any breath could be the last. This gave rise to a new kind of life philosophy, one built not on fear, but on presence. To survive the plague was not just to continue, it was to see the world through a different lens. The plague did not disappear entirely. It would return in waves for centuries, in smaller bursts in different lands. But the pandemic of 1347 to 1353 marked a turning point in human history. It altered economies, broke feudal chains, cracked the church's hold, and seeded modern science. Above all, it changed how we understood ourselves, fragile, finite, and deeply connected. From suffering came change, and from silence, a new kind of voice. History, like a river, does not stop after a flood. It continues, reshaped, deepened, and forever changed. The Black Death was one such flood. It carved deep channels into the soil of civilization, and long after the waters of sorrow receded, its legacy remained. You can still hear it in our stories, see it in our art, feel it in the shape of the world today. Let us now walk softly into the echoes it left behind. Before the plague, art in Europe was largely religious, idolized and reverent. After, it grew more honest, more haunting. Painters began to portray skeletons, coffins and decay, even in religious scenes. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a dominant motif, a skeletal figure leading nobles, peasants, popes and kings to the same inevitable end. This was not a celebration of death, but an acknowledgement of it. Sculptures began to appear that showed decaying corpses, not just saints in splendour. Some tombs, especially those of nobility, included transy effigies, statues of the deceased as skeletal or decomposing bodies, a reminder of mortality carved into marble. It was not morbid, it was honest. Writers too felt the plague's shadow. In Italy, Giovanni Boccaccio wrote the Decameron, a collection of tales told by young nobles who had fled Florence to escape the Black Death. Within the stories are layers of fear, desire and deep reflection. Though fictional, the backdrop was real. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer, though writing slightly later, captured the mood of a world forever changed, one that now saw humour, cruelty and death in sharper detail. And across Europe, sermons, diaries and chronicles became darker, more intimate, more grounded in human frailty. The illusion of permanence had been broken. The Black Death, more than any war or council, shattered old ideas of medicine. Before, illness had been viewed primarily as a spiritual imbalance, a punishment, or a test. After, more people began to question. Could disease have natural causes? Though still centuries away from germ theory, the plague inspired early public health efforts. Cities established plague hospitals and quarantine houses. Port towns introduced isolation periods for ships. The origin of the term quarantine, from the Italian 40 giorni, or 40 days. Councils formed to manage waste and burials. For the first time, urban planning began to consider sanitation and spacing. Some cities created health boards, precursors to modern health departments, and in universities scholars studied human anatomy with fresh urgency. Though knowledge progressed slowly, the seeds of modern medicine were undeniably planted in plague-ravaged soil. The collapse of labour systems created legal ripples. In England, the Statute of Labourers was enacted in 1351, attempting to freeze wages and bind workers back to their lords. It largely failed. Workers now knew their worth, and across Europe, new classes of free peasants and urban tradesmen began to rise. The rigid social pyramid cracked. This shift would echo through revolutions and reforms for centuries, the plague having served as a quiet yet mighty equalizer. Long after the dying stopped, the memory did not. The Black Death became a mythic event, retold in each generation, often with awe and warning. It lived in nursery rhymes, ring-a-ring-a-roses, in grim fairy tales, and in whispered legends. Some cities created memorials, Tall crosses or stone markers to honour the fallen, others held annual masses of remembrance. Yet in many places the memory faded not into reverence, but into cultural instinct, a deeper caution, a learned fear, a knowledge that even a thriving world can fall quiet. The 1347 to 1353 outbreak was the most devastating, but it was not the end. The plague returned again and again in cycles. Some outbreaks were regional, others spread wide. In 1361, a second wave struck Europe, claiming many who had been too young to fall ill the first time. Over the next 300 years, outbreaks became a grim rhythm, the Great Plague of London in 1665 being among the last great strikes before the age of antibiotics. Each recurrence reinforced its legacy. It became not a moment, but a presence, always possible, always feared. In time, the plague became more than a disease. It became symbolic. For poets, it represented judgment, fragility, and change. For artists, a canvas for mortality and truth. For societies, a reminder that no wall, no crown, no prayer could protect from the quiet approach of nature. Even today, the plague remains in our collective consciousness, not just as a tragedy, but as a turning point. During the 19th and 20th centuries, new pandemics emerged: cholera, influenza, HIV, and with them came echoes of old fears. In each case, historians and doctors alike looked back to the Black Death. What had we learned? What had we forgotten? In 1894, the bacterium Yersinia pestis was finally identified by Alexandra Yersin, over 5 centuries after it killed millions. We had given the monster a name, yet its lessons still unfold. The Black Death reshaped the world without a sword or a speech. It left no conqueror's name behind, but its impact lingers. In our cities, in our systems, in our stories. It made us question, made us mourn, made us adapt. And through the echo of centuries it still reminds us that beneath our towers, our screens, our schedules, we are human, and we are fragile. Let us imagine a candle, one small flame flickering in the darkness of a stone chamber. The walls are old, the air smells of ash and parchment. Beyond the window, the night presses close, heavy with wind and memory. This is not a story now, not history, not data. This is a breath shared with all those who came before us, and all those who survived what seemed unsurvivable. The Black Death was not only a crisis of numbers, of bodies, or of law. It was a great silence. It stole voices. It stilled footsteps. It closed church doors, quieted choirs, and hushed the laughter of children. But it did not erase humanity. In the stillness, people whispered. They whispered prayers, even when they doubted. They whispered stories, even when they were afraid. They whispered lullabies to sleeping children and apologies to those who died alone. They whispered names, names of the lost, the missed, the beloved. And in those whispers, they survived. In a world cracked open by sorrow, people planted again. They turned the soil, lit new fires, rebuilt homes. Some carried trauma in their bones, their dreams, their eyes. Others forgot, or tried to, but the silence they had lived through had changed them. They were not the same, nor would the world be. And now you, dear listener, you have walked with them. Through cobbled streets and broken chapels, through fields gone quiet and markets gone still. You have stood at the harbour with ships arriving under ghostly sails. You have looked into the eyes of a plague doctor, masked, distant, but still human. You have knelt beside a mother losing her son, and watched a monk writing in flickering light. You have seen what they saw, you have heard what they heard, you have endured what they endured, in story, in shadow, in quiet reflection. The plague took so much, but it did not take our memory, nor our wonder, nor our ability to look back centuries later and whisper gently, I see you. I remember you. I carry your story now. In every age there are silences. Some come from disease, some from fear, some from the natural weight of being human in an uncertain world, but in every silence there are whispers, hope, connection, the soft persistence of life, flickering, like a single candle in a quiet room. As you rest now, let these words settle gently around you. You are safe, you are warm, you're living in a world built by survivors, by those who lit candles in the dark. You are their dream, you are their future, and they are still with you, in story, in blood, in breath. Sleep now. Let the darkness hold you kindly. Let the wind outside be no threat, only a reminder that you are here, you are alive, and the night is soft,